74-year-old woman approaches royal guard and says 3 words. What happens next will shock you. The morning sun bathed the palace in golden light as tourists gathered at its grand gates, eager to catch a glimpse of the iconic changing of the guard ceremony. The rhythmic stomping of polished boots against the pavement echoed through the air as the elite royal guards, dressed in their signature red coats and towering bearskin hats, took their positions. It was a sight that had captivated visitors for centuries, a symbol of discipline, loyalty, and an unyielding commitment to tradition. The guards, trained to remain motionless no matter what happened around them, stood like statues, their eyes fixed straight ahead. But on this particular day, something unexpected was about to unfold. Amidst the sea of eager tourists, cameras flashing, and children squealing with excitement, a 74-year-old woman named Margaret, Maggie Ellis, moved with a quiet sense of purpose. Unlike the others, she wasn't here for sightseeing or photos. Her steps were deliberate, her eyes scanning the line of royal guards standing at attention. She wasn't looking for just any guard. She was looking for him. Her heart pounded as she finally spotted the one she had been searching for, a tall, well-built man with sharp features and piercing blue eyes, standing rigidly in his ceremonial stance. His presence exuded quiet authority, but Maggie wasn't fooled. She knew the truth. This wasn't just any guard. This was her son. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. She had waited for this for over 50 years. She had searched through adoption records, followed dead-end leads, and battled doubt, wondering if this day would ever come. And now, standing before him, her knees nearly gave way. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself forward. Maggie weaved through the crowd, her breath shallow as she approached the guard. As she drew closer, she noticed the small scar above his left eyebrow, a scar that made her heart clench because she knew exactly where it came from. She remembered it vividly. He had been barely 2 years old. In the only memory she had of holding him, he had tumbled while learning to walk, bumping his head against the wooden floor of their tiny flat. The scar had faded over the years, but it was still there, a mark from a past he didn't even remember. Now, standing before her, he was a grown man, strong and disciplined, unaware of the woman who had brought him into the world. Her hands trembled as she stepped into the forbidden zone, the invisible boundary where no tourist dared to cross. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she stepped forward, her lips parting to say the 3 words she had rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times. She leaned in close, just enough for him to hear, and whispered, "It's me, Charles." For a long moment, there was nothing. The guard remained motionless, his expression unreadable. His grip on his rifle stayed firm, his stance unwavering. To the ordinary eye, it was as though he hadn't even heard her. But Maggie saw it. A flicker of recognition. It was barely noticeable, but she had spent decades looking for her son. She knew every tiny detail about him. And for just a split second, so brief that if she had blinked, she would have missed it, his posture changed. His hands, though still gripping his rifle, tightened just a little. His chest rose slightly, as if he had momentarily lost control of his breathing. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Maggie took another step forward, her heart hammering in her chest. "Charles, it's me." Her voice was soft but urgent, filled with years of longing and regret. Another slight movement. The tiniest shift in his expression. It was so subtle that no one else noticed. But she did. For the first time in 5 decades, her son was standing right in front of her. Tears pricked her eyes as she continued. "I've been looking for you my whole life." The crowd watched, murmuring in confusion. The tourists didn't understand what was happening. To them, she was just an old woman breaking protocol. The guards weren't supposed to react, no matter what. But this was different. This was personal. Before she could say another word, there was a sudden movement. A palace official, dressed in a sleek black suit, stepped forward and placed a hand on Maggie's shoulder. "Ma'am, please step back." A lump formed in Maggie's throat. No, not now. Not when she was this close. She tried to hold her ground. "Please, just let me talk to him. I just need..." "Ma'am," the official interrupted, this time more firmly. You must come with me. Maggie felt a rush of panic. She turned back to Charles, her eyes pleading. Say something. Please say something. But he remained silent, his face impassive. Then, just as she was about to be escorted away, it happened. The guard did something that shocked everyone watching. He blinked. It was a tiny action, but it broke protocol. The guards weren't supposed to react to anything. No movement. No acknowledgement. No expression. Yet Charles blinked, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. And in that brief second, Maggie knew. He had heard her. He had understood. He knew. But the rules of the Royal Guard were strict. He couldn't respond, not now. Maggie was led away, her heart racing. As the official guided her into the palace, she felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: hope, fear, desperation. Had she ruined her only chance? Had she pushed too hard? But deep down, she clung to one unshakable truth. For the first time in 50 years, Charles knew she existed. And that meant the story was only just beginning. Maggie sat in the small, dimly lit room inside a palace, her hands folded tightly on the table before her. The official who had escorted her away from the courtyard had left her alone, leaving only the quiet hum of a security camera in the corner as company. She wasn't under arrest, but she was certainly under scrutiny. Her heart still pounded from the moment outside, the moment she had come so close to reaching Charles. She could still see the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the way his fingers had tightened ever so slightly around his rifle. It was proof that her words had struck something deep inside him. But would it be enough? Would they let her see him? Or worse, would they send her away before she could say anything more? She let out a shaky breath, her thoughts drifting back to the past, the moment her life had changed forever. The tiny flat in East London had barely enough room for Maggie to move around, but it was home. She had worked hard to keep it, scrubbing floors, washing dishes in a cafe, and taking on sewing work in the evenings. But as she sat on the old, creaky bed, rocking her newborn baby in her arms, none of that mattered. He was beautiful. Charles. His tiny fingers curled around hers, his soft breaths warm against her chest. He had his father's piercing blue eyes, and every time he blinked up at her, Maggie felt like her heart might burst. But joy wasn't the only thing that filled her that night. Fear gripped her tightly. She had no family to help her. Her parents had disowned her the moment they found out she was pregnant and unmarried. Her father had called her a disgrace, and her mother had wept from shame rather than sympathy. And Henry had never even known about the baby. They had met in the spring, their love a whirlwind romance, full of stolen kisses and long walks along the Thames. He had promised her the world, and for a short while, she had believed it was possible. But then, he had been deployed. One letter arrived from him, then another. But before she could summon the courage to tell him about the baby, the letter stopped coming. For months she had waited, hoping for news. But the silence stretched on. She had gone to his last known address, only to be told that Henry had been sent on a classified mission overseas. No one knew if he was coming back. And so, she had been left alone. As Charles nestled against her chest, Maggie whispered, "I will always love you, my darling boy." But deep inside, she knew love alone wouldn't be enough to give him the life he deserved. Maggie tried. She worked longer hours, barely sleeping, pushing herself to exhaustion. But it wasn't enough. Charles needed more than a tiny, cold flat and a mother who barely had enough to eat. He needed security, a future. And so, with tears streaming down her face, she made the hardest decision of her life. She walked into an adoption agency, trembling as she explained her situation. "I don't want to give him up," she had whispered. I want him to have a chance." The social worker had been kind, but her words still haunted Maggie. "There are families who can give him everything you can't. Loving him means letting him go." The day she handed him over, she had pressed a small note into the folds of his blanket. "His name is Charles. Please let him know I loved him." Then, with one last kiss on his forehead, she walked away. and for 50 years she had lived with that pain. Maggie never stopped wondering about him. Was he happy? Did he ever wonder about her? Did he ever get the note? For years she thought about searching, but adoption records were sealed. By the time she had the resources to track him down, he was an adult, his life already built without her. Still, she never gave up hope. It wasn't until she was in her 60s that she finally got the break she needed. A new law allowed some adoption records to be accessed, and Maggie immediately requested any information she could find. When she received the file, her hands trembled as she opened it. There it was, the name of his adoptive parents, and below it, a short line that nearly knocked the breath out of her. Currently enlisted in the Army. She spent the next decade tracing every lead, every promotion, every deployment, every fragment of information she could find. And then, just a few months ago, she found him. Charles Ellis. A decorated officer. A man who had dedicated his life to duty, discipline, and service to the crown. A man who had become a royal guard at a palace. The realization had left her in tears. All these years, he had been standing in plain sight. All these years, she had been walking past his place of duty, never knowing. The door opened, snapping Maggie out of her thoughts. A uniformed officer entered, his expression unreadable. "You need to leave now, ma'am," he said. "This is a restricted area." Maggie's heart plummeted. No, not yet. She couldn't leave without talking to Charles. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Just let me see him for a moment." The officer shook his head. "I'm sorry, but that's not possible." Desperation clawed at her chest. "I'm his mother," she pleaded. I just want to talk to him." The officer's expression flickered for the briefest moment. And then, before he could respond, another voice interrupted. "Let her stay." Maggie turned, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the doorway, still in his uniform, was Charles. For the first time in 50 years, they were face to face. His blue eyes, so much like his father's, bore into hers. He looked calm. Too calm. But she knew better. His entire life, he had been trained to hide his emotions. But he couldn't hide this. The air was thick with unspoken words. For a long moment, neither of them moved. And then Charles took a step forward, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Is it true?" Maggie swallowed the lump in her throat. "Yes, my darling. It's true." Her voice trembled, but this time, she wasn't letting go. And neither was he. The room was silent. Maggie felt her entire world hinge on this moment, as she stared into the eyes of the son she had lost half a century ago. Charles, the boy she had given up, the man she had spent her life searching for, stood in front of her in his immaculate Royal Guard uniform, his posture rigid but his eyes betraying something else entirely. Shock. Confusion. A deep buried emotion that he wasn't sure how to handle. For the past hour, Maggie had been pleading with palace officials, trying to explain why she was there, why she had approached him the way she did. Most of them had been dismissive, skeptical. But now, the only person whose opinion truly mattered stood before her. Charles didn't know how to feel. For as long as he could remember, his life had been defined by order and discipline. Raised in a foster home, then a military family, he had learned early on that attachment was a liability. He had been taught to be strong, to bury weakness, to never let emotions dictate his decisions. And now, this woman, a stranger, was claiming to be his mother. It didn't make sense. She had called him by name. She had looked at him as if she had known him forever. She had recognized the scar above his brow, something almost no one else noticed. He swallowed hard. A part of him wanted to dismiss it, to assume this was some deluded woman chasing a fantasy. But another part of him, the part buried deep beneath layers of training, whispered that it might be true. And that scared him. For decades, Charles had never asked questions about his biological parents. What was the point? His adoptive parents had been loving, supportive people who had given him everything he needed. He had never wanted to risk disrupting that with uncertainties about the past. But now, the past was staring him in the face. And he couldn't ignore it. Maggie saw the storm raging in her son's mind. The way his fists clenched and unclenched, the way his jaw tightened as he processed what she was saying. She didn't blame him. How could she? This wasn't just her story to tell. This was his life, his reality, being shattered in real time. She took a shaky breath. "I know this is a lot," she said softly. "I can't imagine how you must be feeling. But please, just let me tell you my story. After that, you can decide if you want to believe me." Charles didn't move, didn't react. But he didn't leave either. And that was enough. Maggie reached into her coat pocket, pulling out an old, yellowed letter, the same letter she had tucked into his blanket the day she gave him up. His name was written on the front. "To my son, Charles." She had no idea if it had ever reached him. If the adoption agency had passed it on or if it had been lost somewhere in time. Her fingers trembled as she set it on the table between them. Charles hesitated before his eyes flickered to the paper. Slowly, almost mechanically, he reached for it. And as his fingers brushed against the warm parchment, a memory surfaced. He was 7 years old, sitting in his bedroom, when he found it. An old box of keepsakes, things his adoptive parents had kept from when they first brought him home. Inside, he found a single letter, unopened, with his name written on it. He had picked it up, curious, running his small fingers over the fragile paper. But before he could open it, his adoptive mother walked in. "What's that, love?" she had asked, her voice gentle but tense. Charles had held up the letter. "It has my name on it." His mother had gone still, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, she walked over, took the letter from his hands, and placed it back in the box. "Not everything from the past needs to be revisited, sweetheart." And that was it. The letter remained unopened. Forgotten. Until now. Charles stared at the letter, his mind racing. He had buried that memory so deep he had convinced himself it wasn't important. But now he wasn't sure. A lump formed in his throat as he looked back up at Maggie. She was watching him so carefully, so hopefully. It would be easy to dismiss this. To walk away. To pretend nothing had changed. That's what he had been trained to do. But for some reason, he didn't want to. His fingers tightened around the letter. His pulse pounded in his ears. And then, finally, slowly, cautiously, he began to open it. The paper crinkled as he unfolded it, revealing words written in delicate, shaky handwriting. "My dearest Charles," it began. His breath hitched. The room seemed to fade away. His eyes moved down the page, reading words that had been waiting for him for 50 years. And as he read, for the first time since stepping into that room, his carefully controlled composure cracked. A single tear rolled down his cheek. Maggie gasped softly, covering her mouth with trembling fingers. Charles didn't wipe it away. For once in his life, he let himself feel. And Maggie? She knew. This was only the beginning. The room felt smaller, the walls closer, as Charles held the fragile letter in his trembling hands. He read each word carefully, slowly, as if absorbing a language he had never seen before but somehow understood. 50 years of questions buried deep within his heart now had answers written in ink on aged paper. "My dearest Charles, if you are reading this, it means you have grown into the man I always knew you would become. I do not know where you are now, or what kind of life you have had. But please, my son, never think for a moment that I did not love you. I loved you before you were even born, and I have loved you every single day since." Charles swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He forced himself to continue reading, but the words blurred slightly, his eyes stinging in a way they never had before. "The decision to give you up was not one I made lightly. I had no choice, my darling boy. The world was cruel to a woman like me back then. I had no money, no family to help, and the man I loved was gone, sent to war before he ever knew you existed. I wanted you to have a life that I could never provide, a home, security, love. A shaky breath escaped his lips as he clenched his jaw. Why had no one told him this? He had spent his entire life believing that whoever had given birth to him simply hadn't wanted him. That he had been unwanted, discarded. But this was a mother's love, woven into every single word. His grip on the letter tightened as he read the last few lines. One day, I hope you'll understand why I did what I did. And if the stars align, if fate is kind, I hope that one day we will meet again. Until then, know this, I have always been with you. And I always will be. With all my love, forever and always. Your mother, Maggie Ellis. Silence hung thick in the air between them as Charles set the letter down on the table, his fingers still resting on the edge of the paper as though afraid to let go. Maggie, sitting across from him, watched him with tears glistening in her eyes, waiting. She didn't push him to speak, didn't demand answers. She just sat there, giving him the time he needed to process the truth. And for the first time in his life, Charles felt like he had no control over his emotions. He had been trained for years, first by the military, then by the elite forces of the Royal Guard, to suppress, to remain composed in any situation. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was his mother. And he was just a son. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, Charles took a deep breath and spoke, his voice raw. You should have told me sooner. Maggie let out a quiet, trembling laugh, not from humor, but from relief. I tried, sweetheart, she whispered. I tried for years. But adoption records were sealed, and when I finally found out where you were, I was afraid. Afraid you wouldn't want to see me. Afraid I had lost my chance. Charles exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything, Maggie said softly. Just know that I never stopped looking for you. He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly feeling so much smaller than he had in years. I spent my whole life thinking I wasn't wanted. Maggie's face crumpled at those words. No, she breathed. No, my darling boy, never. I wanted you every single day. I never stopped thinking about you. Charles pressed his fingers against his temple, trying to push away the rush of emotions. I don't even know who I am anymore. Maggie reached across the table hesitantly, placing her wrinkled, trembling hand over his. You're my son. Her words hit him harder than he expected. Not a soldier. Not a guard. Not a man trained to never show emotion. Just a son. And for the first time, he didn't hate the sound of it. Charles let out a long, controlled breath before speaking again. You said my father was sent to war before he ever knew about me. Maggie nodded, her gaze drifting toward the window as if searching the past. His name was Henry, she said. Henry Calloway. The name meant nothing to Charles. He had never known to ask about his real father. He was kind, Maggie continued, smiling softly at the memory. And he loved me more than anything. But he was a soldier first. The military was his life. And then, one day, his letters stopped coming. Charles stared at her. What happened to him? Maggie hesitated, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. He never came home. The words felt like a blow to the chest. Killed in action? Charles asked. Maggie nodded. I never got full details. Just a letter from the government saying he was missing, presumed dead. And then, nothing. No body. No funeral. Just a name on a war memorial. Charles swallowed hard. He had spent his entire life thinking he was alone. But in reality, he came from a line of soldiers. A father who had served his country and never returned. A mother who had spent decades searching for him. And now, here he was, face to face with the truth he never expected. Maggie could see the way his mind was spinning, the way he was trying to piece it all together. And then, finally, Charles asked the one question she had been waiting for. What now? Maggie smiled gently, squeezing his hand. That's up to you, my love. She didn't push him, didn't beg for a relationship. She just gave him the choice she had never been able to give him before. And after a long pause, Charles finally made his decision. He turned his hand beneath hers, giving her fingers a small, tentative squeeze. I think I'd like to know more. Maggie let out a soft sob, half joy, half relief. I'd like that too. And for the first time in both of their lives, they weren't just two strangers sitting across from each other. They were mother and son, finally reunited. The weight of the moment still hung thick in the air. Charles sat across from Maggie, his posture stiff, his expression carefully guarded, but there was a crack in his carefully maintained control. For the first time in 50 years, he had a piece of his past. A mother who had never stopped loving him, a father who had died before ever knowing he existed, and a lifetime of questions that had never been answered until now. But something inside him still resisted. The military had trained him to trust facts, not emotions. To verify before believing. And while Maggie's story felt real, felt true, there was one thing he needed before he could allow himself to accept it completely. I need proof. Maggie's face fell slightly, and for a moment, Charles wondered if he had just shattered something between them before it had even begun. But then, she nodded. I understand. It had been a long time since Charles had felt nervous. He had faced combat, served in high-pressure environments, and had even stood unflinching in front of the Queen herself. But now, as he sat in a sterile, white-walled clinic, waiting for a nurse to call his name, his hands wouldn't stop tapping against his knee. He hated how much he wanted this to be true. He hated how much he wanted Maggie to be his real mother. But if she wasn't? If the DNA test came back negative? Would it break her? Would it break him? A soft voice called his name, snapping him out of his thoughts. Charles Ellis? He rose, stepping into the small testing room where Maggie was already seated, her hands clasped together in her lap. She smiled when she saw him, but there was uncertainty in her eyes too. Even though she knew the truth, she understood why he needed proof. Are you ready? The nurse asked, holding up a sterile swab. Charles nodded. He had never thought about this moment before. Never once in his life had he considered taking a test to prove who he really was. But as the nurse took a sample from inside his cheek and sealed it in a tube, he felt something inside him shift. There was no turning back now. They would have the results in a few days. And in those days, Charles would have to face the hardest battle of his life, waiting. Time had never moved so slowly. For 3 days, Charles went about his duties as usual, guarding the palace gates, maintaining the composure he had been trained for, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Every moment he wasn't working, he thought about Maggie. He thought about the letter. About the father he had never met. About what it would mean if the test came back positive. Would he have to change the way he saw himself? Would he suddenly stop being Charles Ellis, the soldier, the disciplined protector of the crown, and become Charles Calloway, the son of a woman who had never stopped searching for him? The idea terrified him. And yet, for the first time in his life, he wanted something more than just his job, his duty, his carefully controlled world. He wanted a mother. But what if the test came back negative? Would he lose that chance forever? The email arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. Charles had just finished a shift at a palace when he saw the notification flash on his phone. DNA results ready, open now. His heart pounded. Maggie had texted him earlier that morning, nervous but hopeful. No matter what it says, you'll always have a place in my heart. He hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the screen. Then, he opened it. He scanned the document quickly, looking for the one line that mattered. Then he saw it. 99.99% probability. Mother/son relationship confirmed. The world around him seemed to blur for a second. He felt lightheaded. The proof was right there, written in scientific terms he could no longer deny. Maggie Ellis was his mother. This wasn't just a feeling. It wasn't just a possibility. It was the truth. For the first time since he had met her, Charles felt something inside him crack open. He didn't text Maggie right away. He needed time to process it. So instead, he did something he had never done before. He went home, sat down on his small couch, and just let himself feel. The emotions came in waves. Relief, sadness, anger at all the years lost, hope for what might come next. For hours he sat there, staring at the walls, trying to understand what this meant for his life. And then, finally, he picked up his phone. His fingers shook slightly as he typed the message. "We need to talk." Seconds later, a reply came. "Whenever you're ready, sweetheart. I'll be here." Maggie was waiting for him at a quiet cafe near the palace. When Charles walked in, she stood immediately, searching his face for an answer before he even spoke. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then, Charles exhaled slowly. "It's true." Maggie covered her mouth, her eyes instantly filling with tears. "I knew it," she whispered, her voice breaking. She reached for his hands, and for the first time, he didn't pull away. They sat down together, but neither knew what to say at first. It was real. They were mother and son. But now what? "I don't know how to do this," Charles admitted after a long silence. "I've spent my whole life not thinking about where I came from. Now it's all I can think about." Maggie nodded, squeezing his hand gently. "We take it one step at a time." Charles swallowed. He wasn't used to not having a plan, not knowing what came next. But as he looked at Maggie, at the warmth in her eyes, he realized. He wanted to try. "Can we start over?" he asked softly. Maggie smiled through her tears. "We don't need to start over, my love. We just need to move forward." And for the first time in 50 years, Charles allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. The cafe was quiet, filled with the soft clinking of coffee cups and hushed conversations. But for Charles and Maggie, the world outside barely existed. For the past hour, they had sat together, barely speaking, letting the weight of the DNA test settle in. It was real. She was his mother. And yet, there was still so much unknown. "Tell me everything," Charles finally said, his voice quieter than usual. "About you. About my father. About the life I never had." Maggie smiled, a little sadly, but with warmth. "Where do I even begin?" For the next hour, Maggie talked. She told him about her childhood in East London, about the struggles she had faced as a young woman alone with a baby, about the love she had felt for him from the moment he was born. She told him about his father, Henry Calloway, how they had met, how deeply they had loved each other, and how war had stolen him away before he ever knew he had a son. She told him about the years of searching, the times she almost gave up, and the hope that had kept her going. "I would have found you sooner if I could," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "But I was afraid you wouldn't want me." Charles listened, his expression unreadable. So much of his life had been built around discipline and structure, and now, suddenly, his history was unraveling before him. But he didn't feel lost. For the first time, he felt like he was finding himself. "I don't blame you," he said at last. "I just don't know how to do this." Maggie reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. "Then we do it together." The next few weeks were strange. At first, Charles kept his distance. He was used to solitude, to a life of rules and routines. Having someone suddenly care about him, someone who wanted to know about his day, about his past, about his thoughts, it was overwhelming. But Maggie was patient. She never pushed, never asked for more than he was willing to give. She would send him texts in the morning, simple ones. "Good luck on your shift today, sweetheart. Thinking of you. Hope you're well. No pressure, but I'm making shepherd's pie tonight. Your father loved it. Let me know if you want some." At first, he didn't always reply. But as the days passed, he found himself waiting for her messages. Then one night, after an exhausting shift, he found himself standing outside her door. Maggie opened it, surprised but delighted. Charles cleared his throat, suddenly feeling like a child again. "I never got to try shepherd's pie." Maggie's smile was pure joy. "Well, then we better fix that." That night, for the first time in as long as he could remember, Charles felt at home. A few weeks later, Maggie and Charles visited the war memorial where Henry's name was engraved. For the first time, Charles felt like he had a connection to something greater than himself. He knelt down, tracing the name with his fingers. "I wish I had known you," he whispered. "But I'll make you proud." Beside him, Maggie gently placed a single white rose. It was a moment of closure, for both of them. The past had been painful. But now, it didn't have to define them. They were moving forward. Together. The sun shone brightly over a palace as tourists gathered once again to watch the changing of the guard. But this time, one particular visitor stood quietly at the gates, Maggie. She watched with pride as Charles stood among the elite guards, his posture straight, his presence commanding. He still had the discipline, the strength, the composure. But now, he had something more. He had family. As the ceremony ended, Charles glanced toward the crowd. For a brief second, his eyes met Maggie's. And for the first time in history, a royal guard broke protocol. He gave her the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. A nod that said everything. "I see you. I know you. I love you." And for Maggie, that was more than enough.